We have some policy rock stars in this one for you today. I'd like to introduce your panel moderator, who will introduce those rock stars. She's probably familiar to most of you. Jamie Haley is the principal at Jamie Haley Consulting and co-founder of Low Country Local First, where she served as executive director for 15 years. Jamie's been named in the 50 most progressive, the most influential women in business, and an economic development ambassador for the state of South Carolina. Please welcome Jamie and our panelists.
Good morning. Thank you, Charles. I wish that we were all there in the music hall eating some Callie's biscuits together, and I'm sure that will happen very soon. So in the meantime, I think it's wonderful that we have the opportunity to continue these important discussions on how we can do well and good as a business community. And I'm excited about this particular conversation that we're going to have today about a policy agenda to save independent businesses. I think that while there have been obviously numerous struggles over the past year, one of the things that has certainly come to light is the value that local businesses, independent businesses, and small businesses have bring to our communities. And not just to our communities and the quality of life that they provide, but also the economic impact that they have. Yet we know that 30% of these businesses have closed over the last year, while at the same time, the large corporations, you know, the Amazons, the Walmarts, the Targets, have seen their profit shares rise by at least 17%. So we also know that, you know, typically after a recession, it's Black and brown businesses that have the hardest time in recovering from that recession. And so what we're going to talk about today is, you know, sort of beyond, I think, the immediate relief that is being provided at mostly a federal level and in some communities also at a state and local level. But how do we actually change the groundwater? How do we actually change policies that truly create a level playing field for these local independent businesses that are so valuable to our communities? And then how do we reframe inclusion as integral to part of economic growth? So we have a lot to talk about in a very short amount of time. And I'm really excited about the panelists that we have joining us today because they are experts in their fields. They are working in policy, they're working on policy issues. They provide technical assistance, and they're also educating the general public on why these things are so important. So I'm going to give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. And I'm going to start with Stacy. So Stacy, can you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you're with and what your role is there?
Yeah, it's just wonderful to be here today, and I'm just so grateful for this conversation with both of you. I'm Stacy Mitchell. I'm the co-executive director of the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We're a national nonprofit research and advocacy organization. We focus on building thriving, equitable communities, and a big part of our focus, a big concern that we have, is about growing concentration in the economy and really the need to disperse economic power in order to build a more equitable and sustainable future. We work across a number of different program areas: energy, broadband, and so on. I run our independent business program, and so really focused particularly on what are the policy issues that we need to shift in order to create room for independent businesses to start up and grow. We have staff in a number of different places around the country. Most of our staff's in Minneapolis. I'm here in Portland, Maine. But it's also nice to be visiting South Carolina virtually, which prior to the pandemic, I did a lot because I have two siblings. One is outside of Charleston, the other's in Spartanburg, and my dad's in Columbia. So it's been more than a year now since I've been in the state, but glad to be there a little bit virtually today.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy, for joining us. I can't really think of a time that I've been involved in this work that we haven't relied on the Institute of Local Self-Reliance for so much of the great policy work that they do. So thank
Thanks.
you for joining us. And Xiomara, thank you for joining us from the West Coast. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in and being part of this wonderful conference. My name is Xiomara Peña. I'm the Vice President of Engagement at Small Business Majority, where I've had the opportunity to work here for the last 7 years, serving small business owners, both on the West Coast as well as nationally. As on a national nonprofit small business advocacy organization, we, Small Business Majority, for the last 15 years have really dedicated ourselves to addressing the needs of America's diverse and small business owners, their employees. We also focus on self-employed entrepreneurs, particularly in underserved communities. Of our close to 70,000 strong small business network, more than half of the people that we serve are people of color, about 56%. And a little bit over half are women business owners. So our emphasis on supporting underrepresented communities is definitely key to ensuring our work building local and inclusive and equitable, thriving communities for small business owners. As a national nonprofit, we focus on those issues of key importance to small business: healthcare, paid family leave, access to capital, general entrepreneurship issues, and the like. All of these policy areas are areas in which we need to have more diverse voices at the table, really defining what solutions are necessary for the different small business owners, whether you're a self-employed person or whether you're a micro business with less than 10 employees. Those solutions are very, very different. And so our focus has always been in 3 different areas: research, advocacy, and education. And never has that been more important than this last year. As an advocate for small business, I can tell you I've had the countless opportunity to speak with so many business owners across the country. And one thing that is clear, and Rick mentioned some of those data sets that I think we were ready to also discuss and dive into. This has been a challenging year for small businesses. The policies that we need in order to rebuild stronger, to build back better, to be equitable in our policy making is going to be key to a speedy recovery. And so this last year, I know, has been a very challenging one for all of the business owners, regardless of the industry that you're in, but it has not impacted businesses the same way. And so we're really excited about, diving deeper into some of the policy solutions that we recommend as we think about rebuilding for a better and stronger economy.
Great. Yes, thank you. I mean, we have a lot to talk about, and I'll just kind of, it was good to see that that they just changed sort of the PPP process to allow for businesses that had 20 employees or less a window of opportunity to sort of be able to access those loans. And I think that unfortunately that didn't happen a year ago. A lot of those businesses don't exist anymore, but it's good to see it happening now. Literally everybody's been learning to fly while flying the plane. So I'm curious. We don't have a whole lot of time, and Stacy, let's start with you. But what types of policies do you think are going to be the most impactful for supporting independent businesses moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I guess it's maybe a little bit of helpful maybe to just understand how we approach thinking around this whole area. We've seen over the last several decades a sharp decline in the number of independent small businesses. Overall in the economy, if you go back a few decades ago, businesses with fewer than 100 employees accounted for about 40% of the economy. Today, it's down to about 23%. So we've seen that in a lot of different sectors. We have fewer Black-owned small businesses today than we did in the 1970s. And it's become harder to start a new business than it used to be. And the conventional wisdom around that, like what we're sort of taught to believe about that, is that small businesses can't compete, that bigger businesses are more efficient, they're more effective, and so on. And this is just, the price of progress. The bigger businesses can deliver more. But what our research has shown in one sector after another is that that's not actually the case, that there are lots of ways in which independent small businesses actually outperform their big competitors, and that they also deliver distinct market benefits. They do specific things within their industries, their markets, and their communities that big companies simply cannot match. And that they're able to do those things because they're small, not in spite of being small. And we see this, as I said, across sectors, and have done a lot of research really documenting it. So that raises the question then, well, if small businesses are in fact very competitive and really good at what they do, why have we seen this shrinking of the small business sector? And what we have found is that in the 1980s and the 1990s, a way of thinking kind of infected policymaking. There was this idea that bigger was better, that bigger corporations were going to deliver more, that they were going to lower prices and deliver bigger benefits, and that they were just sort of more advanced, if you will. And that was those ideas were embraced by both Republicans and Democrats, and they began to infect policymaking in the 1980s and 90s and at all levels of government. All the way from federal, all the way down to local. It's why we see a lot of cities giving big tax breaks to big corporations that are not available to local businesses. It's why Amazon has paid virtually no federal taxes in recent years, whereas the typical independent retail business that Amazon is competing with is paying an effective rate of 20% or more. I could go on and on and on. There are just lots of ways in which policymakers have tilted the playing field. But the things that I wanted to particularly draw people's attention to today, because they're issues with real momentum, one is antitrust policy. In the 80s, we turned antitrust policy on its head. For decades before, 100 years before, antitrust policy had really kept markets open and fair and had prevented large companies from using their size to crush and exclude their smaller competitors. We got rid of that. We really relaxed and stepped away from the enforcement of those laws in a number of ways. And that is directly connected to the rise and dominance of Walmart in the food system, of Tyson Foods, of Amazon's role as this incredibly powerful gatekeeper in the digital economy. All of those things are connected to those changes in policy. There is a big movement afoot right now, growing anti-monopoly movement, and we're going to see legislation proposed in Congress this year to reinvigorate those laws. We're very actively engaged in that, and we know that independent business owners are going to be crucial to whether we're going to be able to pass those bills that are coming, but would make a huge difference. And then the other thing that I want to just name is where we direct our capital. I think the way that policy has tilted the playing field, we saw obviously in the last year, we saw that clearly play out in the pandemic. We have a tendency to talk about the pandemic, the impact on the economy as though, that was caused by something outside of our control. Obviously, the virus is outside of our control, but the policy response to the pandemic was very much in our control. And what we saw was, the Federal Reserve opened up a spigot of cash for very big companies and extended these rickety, system of loans that a lot of businesses, particularly businesses owned by people of color, were unable to grab onto, and just a completely different way of approaching the problem, depending on big or small business. But that whole issue of access to capital is one that transcends the pandemic. As many in the audience know, as the banking system has consolidated and we have bigger and bigger banks, those banks are directing their lending and their financial support to bigger corporations. They don't do a lot of small business lending. And then we have seen the local banking system and CDFIs and credit unions really shrink. And I think the pandemic has woken people up to that dynamic. And there's a realization that we really need to do something about the lending system. And it's, again, particularly hard on entrepreneurs of color. There was a stat that I saw the other day from a new study that among Latino businesses businesses with exactly the same characteristics, the same profitability and everything else, 1/3 is likely to be approved for a loan than white-owned businesses. We're one of the areas that, and I'll just wrap up by saying, one of the areas that we're really pushing on to shift capital is reform at the Small Business Administration. SBA's loan programs over time have changed. They've gone to, they've become bigger and bigger loans. They're serving fewer and fewer women and entrepreneurs of color. So we're working right now on a set of reform recommendations for that as a really good place to start with this problem of access to capital.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's a lot of change that needs to occur, and access to capital is always the thing that we hear about the most when it comes to the challenges of small business owners. And, we lived that out firsthand at Low Country Local First, last year with trying to, help people navigate that system and trying to identify lenders who would work with individuals, and even, personally contacting people we knew within the banks to see if they would work with people. So that was absolutely true. And then just sort of a lack of trust of the system and concerned about, whether their loan was going to be forgiven. So I think that continues to be an ongoing challenge. And I think it's great that is an area that you guys are working in, not only with the antitrust is incredibly important. And I often think that small business owners don't fully grasp the impact that has, because it's not something like a Walmart that you see and you can go, okay, there's my competitor. And often it's something that small businesses use as a resource within their own business, right? So maybe they're purchasing their display fixtures or their office supplies. And so that's a challenge. And until everybody, including the small business community, understands that challenge, it's going to be harder to make those policy changes that are going to be necessary to create that level playing field, because we need those voices at the table, right? So Xiomara, what would your top policy recommendations be to save independent businesses?
Yeah, I think, it's really important that we consider, and I love this idea of, let's think about the long-term policy priorities here, because so much I feel of the last year has been addressing these short-term immediate needs, and yet we lose sight of the fact that we need transformative change. We need to have transformative policy to ensure that the systems on access to capital change in a huge way. We need to ensure that, and so some of the policies that we are looking at as it pertains to access to capital, pardon me, would be to reauthorize a program very similar to the state Small Business Credit Initiative. We know that reauthorization may be included in this upcoming stimulus package. That's a huge program and a huge vehicle that was established several years ago to be able to draw down federal dollars to be able to give more loans. And in South Carolina, we had over about $18 million in SSBCI that was drawn down to operate two credit support programs, both the Capital Access Program and to increase loan participation. And so given that they're looking at adding dollars into the state Small Business Credit Initiative, I think that's a healthy start and a long-term investment that could be made at the federal level for the state ultimately to be able to draw down those funds and reuse that funding to be able to make a good amount of loans and impact in that state. The other thing that I think is important, and Stacy referenced this, but the role of community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, cannot be understated. I think that, CDFIs, when the traditional lending institutions fail small businesses that are looking for, less than $150,000 of capital, they turn to a CDFI if they know of them. There's a visibility challenge, I think, with CDFIs by and large. And so we're trying to change that. But more funding needs to be done, either an expansion of the existing funding to the CDFI fund, or funding it by at least $3 billion to ensure that enough CDFIs have the liquidity that they need. We know that anytime there's a pandemic, credit markets tighten up, and it's very challenging for business owners to access the capital, as it is prior to the pandemic, and it will become a little bit more harder now. The other thing that I think is important, we've talked a lot about the loan programs that have been established over the last year. And Stacy also mentioned this, we need to make significant improvements to the Small Business Administration, whether it's around the technical assistance that's provided or whether it's around the loan programs that they administer. And we have to do away with thinking that the policy structures or mechanisms are a one solution fits all. Not all small business owners are the same. We have our self-employed small business owners, which by and large, we have a large population of businesses owned by people of color are self-employed structures. And so even when it came to accessing, the immediate federal relief programs, I think there was an innate challenge and confusion around, well, if I don't have payroll, I don't qualify for this. And so when we think about whether it's accessing technical assistance resources, which is incredibly important to build that foundation to grow your business, whether it's around getting a loan for working capital or to rebuild or for startup costs, those are also oftentimes left out if they're not tied to job creation in a local or state level. So that is also a population of the small business community that we have to continue to be mindful of. It's growing with the gig economy and the freelance economy expanding, and we expect that will continue to expand as folks look at other sources of income or have been impacted by the pandemic and have lost their job. Entrepreneurship tends to be one of the avenues of rebuilding after a pandemic. We have our self-employed individuals. We have our micro businesses with less than 10 employees, the same solutions that work for a business with up to 500 employees, which is also considered a business by some definitions, are not going to work for the local coffee shop with their 10 employees, right? Beyond the micro businesses, we have employer firms, we have non-employer firms. So we really have to design policy, especially around capital, for these different levels of small businesses, rather than assuming that the SBA 7A is going to suffice, or the SBA 504 is going to be accessible to all of these different types of businesses. Beyond the capital, I think one thing that has also been incredibly meaningful over the last year is the baseline. What are those policy mechanics that support businesses at all levels? And this includes, strengthening the Affordable Care Act. This includes ensuring that folks have access to saving for their retirement. In several states, we've seen secure choice bills, and which eventually have turned into laws. And we've seen states establish retirement savings vehicles where small businesses and their employees start gaining access to retirement saving, because those markets are typically not clients or target clients of large wealth investments firms. And so they're oftentimes locked out just because they don't generate enough income. And so the retirement savings, I think, is incredibly important in the future. Investments to our healthcare program, our Affordable Care Act, I think is going to be incredibly important for small businesses, especially given, healthcare continues to be a top of mind issue for many small businesses. And then there's a whole plethora of other tax reform that we can think of, and the work that Stacy Mitchell is also leading with antitrust, anti-monopoly. I mean, this is a huge space to be able to think about transformative policy and really helping to level the playing field for small businesses.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it just, hearing both of you speak and your wealth of knowledge and expertise in this area, it brings to light so many of the issues. I was talking to some friends of mine a couple of weeks ago who are all small business owners, and they were like, the burden of healthcare shouldn't be on the small business owner, right? That's a really expensive burden for them to carry. And so, I think that that's something that you mentioned and needs to be looked at with how do we change the Affordable Care Act so that it can, so that burden doesn't necessarily fall on a small business owner and people do have good health care. So, and one size definitely doesn't fit all. And I think that that's wonderful that you're working on reform at the SBA, because their definition of a small business is certainly not the businesses that both of your organizations and Low Country Local First and many others on this at this summit today represent. So I think, for a little inspiration, are there places where you all have seen that communities are getting it right, either at a state level or at a very local level, where they are changing things. All politics are local, so they are changing things within their own communities to support their small businesses. Either one of you have any examples of where you've seen something that's been inspiring that could be used in other communities across the country?
I'll talk about one of the things that we've seen happen and I'm really excited that this is going to be launching in about 15 southern states, which is this concept and that was talked about also grant programs. We've seen states step up. It's one of those things where we know that capital is so critical to survival right now. Just survival, just basic. Let me stay in business. I want to be around for my community. I want to continue to be the makeup of this fabric, local economy that is so meaningful. And I've worked my entire life to support and maintain. We've heard it all from small business owners. And so there have been several states, Pennsylvania drew down CARES Act dollars to establish their grant program. South Carolina, I know, also established a grant program that was by and large supporting minority business owners. California, New York, they've established grant programs. I'll talk briefly. I thought this was incredibly powerful, but the California grant program that just closed their second round allocated initially $500 million for our grant program. In the first round, within a window of about, I want to say it was like 14 days or so, they received nearly $300,000 completed applications, totaling request of $4.4 billion. That wasn't for both rounds, that was for one of the rounds. And so the need by and large exceeds the funding that is established. Since that, our governor and legislators are looking to add an additional $2 billion based on the tremendous amount of need that was experienced as a result of the applications that they received. Grants are critical. It's money that doesn't have to be repaid. Businesses we have to preserve. And so we've seen the makeup of who's receiving the grants. They looked at priorities with minority women, business owned by people of color, businesses in rural regions. And I think several of the other states have also designed their grant programs in those manners where they're looking at really trying to support those businesses that need an additional helping hand and maybe haven't been able to access the federal relief programs because of an migratory status. We know that ITIN holders, while they pay into our tax system, were largely left out of federal relief programs. It sounds like there was some clarification in this last announcement and guidance that was issued just yesterday. That is going to be great. In the South, we have these, likewise to the grant programs, we've seen some resiliency funds that have been stood up to really establish one portal that's gathering resources from philanthropy and from private companies, as well as from public companies. So it's a public-private partnership to be able to really build some liquidity for other CDFIs to give capital to business owners that they otherwise may not be able to lend, just given right now they're tightening in credit. We've seen that those rebuilding funds stood up in California and New York, and there is a program called the Southern Opportunity and Resilience Fund, which operates across 15 different states. It will start giving loans in, I believe, in April. Be on the lookout for an announcement next week, but it's leveraging several different CDFI partners to be able to, again, give a low cost and affordable loans to small businesses. And this could be a vehicle that ultimately is able to even draw down some of that SSBCI funding to be able to match and increase in-state funding through this vehicle. So we're hopeful that conversations will continue to unfold and there might be opportunities to strengthen this program. I'll also just say, you know, in Colorado and several other states, we've seen the passing of secure choice bills. We've seen a restructuring. And so there are some places that are doing right. I want to pass it over to Stacy if she wants to share some examples as well.
That's all great. That's all really great to hear about. And I also love your thinking about, you know, the need to design our lending systems and SBA programs based on size of business. One of the people we interviewed as part of our SBA reform research said, you know, we don't just need a small business administration, we need a tiny business administration, which I think, you know, really speaks to that problem. Yeah, there's some really, I think, great examples at the local level. We have been tracking a lot of the COVID response that's been happening at the local and state level. We have something called the Big List that my colleague Kennedy Smith has put together, which is a list of all of the local and state programs with some details about each. And within that, there's a lot of rich examples of how different places have approached this. And she put together a report a couple months back called 26 Actions that local leaders can take to help small businesses weather the pandemic. And those are some, you know, again, sort of lift up what are some of the key things to be doing right now, drawing on real examples, you know, of places that are actually doing that, some of the kinds of things that Xiomara talked about. In addition to that, I would just sort of stepping back a little bit from the pandemic, would say a couple of things. I mean, one, I can't underscore how significant this movement in Congress is to address monopoly power. You know, in the House, we had a year-long investigation into big tech that came out with a really terrific report and set of recommendations, and is now beginning to act on those recommendations in terms of legislation. That was the House Antitrust Subcommittee. And that report found that, you know, Amazon has monopoly power and that it uses that monopoly power to undermine and undercut and drive out of the market independent businesses. So pretty forceful findings. On Monday, in partnership with Low Country Local First and other business groups across the country, we held an event with the congressman who's leading that effort for independent business owners. We'll have the video up in a few days of that, but we had 370 businesses turn out for that event. Really great discussion and a lot of engagement. And we just know from talking to lawmakers about this that business owners are going to make the difference in whether or not we're able to pass this. That right now is the moment. This window will close, but this issue is live at the moment. So would really encourage people to get involved in that, and you can do so through our organization. And then at the local level, we published a guide last summer called Fighting Monopoly Power on how states and cities can address monopoly power directly and strengthen local businesses and local economic systems. And there's all sorts of great stuff in there. You know, we talk about cities that have put limits on chains in order to open up room in the market for more locally owned businesses. San Francisco is a really good example of that. We also talked about places that have addressed the growing proliferation of dollar store chains, which are not only coming into small towns and driving the local grocer out, leaving people with only, you know, the processed food at the dollar store chain as their shopping option, but we're also seeing this in urban neighborhoods, and in particularly in Black neighborhoods, where Family Dollar and Dollar General are massing together and really making it impossible for local grocers to survive and to thrive in those areas. And so with a lot of ramifications. So there are a number of cities that we've been working with, Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, that have passed restrictions on dollar store chains, and in conjunction with that, incentives to help support the formation of locally owned grocery stores in those communities. Some really good examples there. You can also read in that guide about places that have addressed the banking problem. I mean, one of the things that we saw with the PPP is that if you were a business located in, say, in North Dakota, you were 2 to 3 times as likely to be able to get your hands on a PPP loan as if you were a business located in Arizona. And the reason for that is that North Dakota has far more locally owned banks and credit unions. And so there's just was much greater distribution and relationships on the ground with local banking institutions and CDFIs, importantly. And other states that have fewer local banks were really struggling. And that happened in the context of the PPP, but it's something that's happening all the time normally. And North Dakota is a state, one of a number of states that have really strong policies about local banks. And in fact, over 80% of deposits in North Dakota are held by locally owned banks and credit unions and other local financial institutions. And it makes a huge difference in terms of capital flowing to small businesses. There are a number of cities and other states that are now looking at the model in North Dakota with the idea of replicating that, including Philadelphia, Oakland, and some other places.
Great. Well, Stacy, you just talked about, the number of businesses that sort of jumped on board and are bringing their voice to the conversation around the antitrust issues. And, I know myself from being in this work for a long time, how valuable that is. So what recommendations do you each have as sort of the closing question here for the people who are on this call today, who are local business owners and people who work in local businesses, and also just people who are involved in the community and care about the community that we live in? How can they lend their voice to create power in these conversations that are being had? Xiomara, would you like to start with that?
Sure. One of the things I mentioned, we're a small business advocacy organization, but even when we have our sign-on campaigns and our research, and when we are connecting to policymakers and informing them of policy recommendations, we cannot do this work alone. We need to have small business voices at the table with us to be able to have your voices amplified and really understood. Whether it's placing fee caps on platform companies that are servicing your business, or whether it's more accessible and transparent capital. We need to have your voices. Your voices matter. There's so many ways to get involved in advocacy, whether it's via sign-on campaigns, whether it's sharing your story and having that message amplified, whether it's speaking to reporters, whether it's connecting with your local assembly member or a congressional member at the federal level. There are so many opportunities. You do not have to do this alone. There are several organizations that are also willing to support you in looking for those opportunities. We just need, and I just want to mention, small business voices are one of the top trusted messengers in this country. They were prior to the pandemic, with so much mistrust in our institutions over the last year. I think there was a recent report that shows that there are even now more trusted messengers. And so we just want to reiterate, there is so much power in leveraging your voice. And we welcome you to become part of our network, which is completely free to do.
That's great. I put a couple of links in the chat to some of the ways if you want to get informed and engaged, particularly on the antitrust front, but also just our newsletter and sort of how to connect with the research and work that we're doing in this area. And I will just say, we're a sort of think tank, so we're not a membership organization. And so, our ability to move these issues really depends on the partnerships we have, particularly with local business organizations. We love working with Low Country Local First and Small Business Majority. We're really excited to be working more with you around the antitrust issue going forward, and some of the work around lending, and just that those relationships are really what help drive drive this policy forward.
Well, Thank you both. I mean, this is so much information and great information, and we hope that that everybody that has sat in on this panel discussion today has found something valuable to take away. That they have feel like they have gained a little bit of insight and feel empowered to advocate on their behalf. I think that is really such an important thing. And I know that we've got links to both of your organizations in the chat. And of course, Low Country Local First is always a great resource and can help connect business owners to your organizations when you all are looking for those voices, whether it's for an article that you're writing for a national publication and you need those voices, or it's because you are actually speaking on the floor at Congress and testifying about the importance of antitrust laws or changing the financial institutions so that these businesses actually have a level playing field so that they can exist and continue to contribute to our communities and our economy. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much, these panelists, for these insights. I hope it inspired all of you to take action on the change we need to level the playing field for independent businesses. The voices of business owners are very influential to elected officials. Remember that.